He cast her aside before the entire kingdom, a king's cruel decree shattering her world. But when the blood moon burned in the sky, his wolf would howl her name, drawn by a fate he could no longer deny. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The gown was a masterpiece of spun moonlight and river pearls, a cascade of white silk so fine it seemed to float around Evelyn Cross's slender frame. In the tall silver mirror of her chambers, she saw not a bride, but a ghost adorned for a sacrifice. Jewels, cold and heavy, glittered at her throat and in her hair, each one a link in the chain that bound her to this fate. Her family, the ancient and respected House of Cross, was a ship taking on water, its coffers drained, its influence waning. This marriage to the Alpha King Alaric was the last desperate plug for the leak, a daughter traded for survival. Evelyn smoothed a hand over the impossibly smooth fabric, her reflection showing a woman whose eyes held a storm of nervous hope, a stark contrast to the placid joy expected of a royal bride. She had met him only a handful of times, brief and formal encounters where he stood like a statue carved from winter stone. King Alaric was distant, his words clipped, his gaze sweeping past her as if she were just another piece of courtly furniture. Yet despite his coldness, she felt an inexplicable pull towards him, a strange, deep hum in her blood whenever he was near, a foolish secret warmth that she had nurtured in the lonely corners of her heart. She prayed it was the nascent stirrings of a mate bond, a sign that this political contract could, with time, become something real. The great oak doors of the grand hall swung open, and a hush fell over the glittering assembly. Evelyn began her walk, a solitary figure in white against the dark, polished stone floor. The hall of Silverwood Keep was a testament to the power of the Alpha Kings, its vaulted ceilings so high they seemed to touch the heavens, its walls hung with tapestries depicting epic hunts and glorious battles. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the cloying scent of moon petal flowers and the varied, expensive perfumes of the werewolf world's most powerful nobles. Hundreds of eyes followed her, a glittering sea of power, ambition, and barely concealed contempt. She could feel their gazes like physical things, assessing her, judging her, weighing her worth against the honor of sharing blood with their king. She saw the predatory smiles of the court members, the sharp, knowing looks exchanged between rival alphas and their lunas. To them, she was an upstart, a girl from a fallen house with nothing to offer but a pretty face and an old name. Her inner monologue was a frantic prayer, a desperate wish for this to be a true union, for Alaric to see her, to truly see the woman beneath the silken jewels, and find her worthy. Each step toward the altar at the far end of the hall felt like a step toward her own execution, the weight of her family's expectations a crushing burden on her shoulders. There he stood. King Alaric, in his full regalia, was an imposing figure of absolute authority. He was tall and broad, a king in every sense of the word. His presence so powerful it seemed to draw all the light in the room toward him. As she reached the dais and stood beside him, he did not turn, did not offer a hand, did not even grant her a glance. His focus was entirely on the assembled court, his jaw set like granite. The High Elder began the ancient rites, his voice a low drone that echoed in the profound silence. When the moment came, the moment for the vows of acceptance, the elder turned to the king. "Do you, King Alaric of the Silverwood Pack, accept this union?" Alaric let the silence stretch, a cruel, deliberate pause that frayed every nerve in Evelyn's body. Then he looked not at her, not at the elder, but out at the sea of expectant faces. His voice, when it came, was like the crack of ice on a frozen lake, sharp, cold, and utterly final. "This court bears witness. I, King Alaric of the Silverwood Pack, find this union insufficient." A collective gasp rippled through the hall, a wave of pure shock. The House of Cross offers nothing but sentiment, And my kingdom cannot be fortified with feelings. The pact is broken. There will be no marriage. The humiliation was absolute. A public stripping of her dignity before the entire world. The guests turned to cruel whispers, to snickers, to the rustle of fine fabrics as every noble turned to stare at the rejected bride. The world dissolved. The glittering nobles, the soaring arches, the scent of flowers, it all melted into a meaningless, painful blur. Evelyn stood frozen, the blood draining from her face, her body turning to ice. The beautiful gown now felt like a costume for a fool. The whispers of the crowd grew louder, a chorus of mockery and scorn that beat against her ears. From the corner of her eye, she saw her father, Lord Valerius Cross, his face a mask of purple rage and disbelief. "Your Majesty, you gave your word," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation as he lunged forward. Before he could take 2 steps, 2 members of the king's royal guard, clad in black and silver armor, moved with silent, brutal efficiency, seizing his arms and restraining him. He struggled, a proud lord reduced to a sputtering, helpless old man. It was then, in that moment of complete and utter shattering, that Alaric's eyes finally met hers. For a single fleeting heartbeat, the cold mask of the king fell away. In the depths of his silver eyes, she saw none of the cruelty his words had carried. Instead, she saw a flash of raw, agonizing regret, a silent, desperate warning that screamed at her across the space between them. It was a look that made no sense, a tortured glimpse of a man at war with himself. It was the first, bewildering clue that this rejection, this public execution of her honor, was far more than it seemed. The look vanished as quickly as it came, replaced once more by the impenetrable coldness of the Alpha King. The spell of her paralysis broke. Survival instinct, raw and primal, took over. Evelyn turned, her body moving on its own accord, and fled. She did not run with grace. She scrambled from the dais, her white wedding gown trailing behind her like the ghost of a dead dream. She heard the rising tide of laughter and derisive commentary from the court, but it sounded distant, as if it were happening to someone else. She pushed past stunned servants and bewildered guards, her only thought to escape, to find a place where no eyes could see her, where she could finally break. Her lungs burned, and tears streamed down her face, blurring the winding stone corridors into a gray tunnel. She didn't stop until she burst through a small, rusted iron gate at the far edge of the castle grounds, stumbling into a forgotten, overgrown garden. Here, nature had reclaimed what royalty had abandoned. Thorny roses grew in wild, tangled masses, their blooms choked by weeds. Crumbling statues of long, dead queens were covered in moss, their stone faces serene and indifferent to her plight. Hidden among the thorns and the crumbling stone, a place as broken and neglected as she now felt, Evelyn finally allowed herself to collapse. She sank to her knees on the damp earth, the pristine white of her gown soiling instantly. The fragile dignity she had clung to shattered into a million pieces, and a sob, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, was torn from her throat, muffled by the ancient silent stone. Weeks bled into one another, each day a smear of gray indistinguishable from the last. The opulent chambers with their silver mirrors and silk sheets were a distant, painful memory. A life that belonged to another woman entirely. Evelyn and what remained of her family, her shamed father a ghost, haunting his own skin, and her mother a phantom of weeping sighs, now resided in the damp, neglected servants' quarters, tucked deep into the castle's belly. The air here was perpetually cold and smelled of mildew, wet stone, and boiled cabbage, a constant, nauseating reminder of their precipitous fall from grace. Her fine dresses, symbols of a future that had been publicly executed, were gone. In their place were simple, coarse-spun tunics, the rough fabric a constant irritant against skin once swathed in velvet and silk. Her life became a litany of menial tasks, a rhythm of grueling, mindless labor. She scrubbed stone floors until her knees were permanently bruised, and her hands were raw with the chemical sting of lye soap. She hauled heavy buckets of water from the central well. Her muscles, once soft and unused, screaming in protest with every step. Her most consistent duty was in the kitchen's herb gardens, a small walled patch of green where her fingers, once accustomed to the delicate dance of embroidery needles, now dug in the cold, damp earth, tending to rosemary, sage, and thyme. The other servants, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, initially shunned her. She was a walking omen, the disgraced bride of a wrathful king, and proximity to her felt like a contagion they were unwilling to risk. They gave her a wide berth in the narrow corridors, their whispers following her like the rustle of dead leaves, dissecting her shame. Yet, in this brutal anonymity, this stripping away of everything she had ever been, Evelyn found a strange and unexpected freedom. With no title to uphold, no jewels to polish, and no crushing weight of expectation to bear, there was nothing left to pretend to be. Her hands grew calloused, her back ached with a permanent dull fire, but her spirit, rather than breaking under the strain, began to harden. The soft, hopeful girl who had walked to the altar was being burned away in the crucible of humiliation, and in the ashes, something tougher, something more resilient and watchful, was taking root. The simple warmth of the kitchen fires at the end of a long day became a profound comfort, the scent of baking bread a small grounding pleasure in a life reduced to its most basic elements. She was no longer a lady, but she was still alive, and a quiet, defiant spark began to glow in the deepest part of her, a tiny flame refusing to be extinguished by the cold. While Evelyn found a strange peace in the dirt, King Alaric found only torment on his throne. The Alpha King became a storm cloud moving through the castle, his presence a palpable pressure that made even the most hardened warriors flinch. He was harsher, his commands clipped and unforgiving, his temper a whip that lashed out at the slightest provocation. He drove his warriors to the point of utter exhaustion in the training yards, their drills lasting from dawn until long after dusk, the clang of steel on steel a constant angry ringing throughout the keep. He was a man possessed, hollowing out his own men in an attempt to exhaust the beast raging within him. At night, when the castle fell into a strained silence, he found no rest. He was often seen pacing the highest battlements, a solitary figure silhouetted against the night sky, his gaze fixed on the waxing moon as if it were an enemy. Its silvery light seemed to mock him, to pull at something deep inside him he was desperate to keep chained. His Bates, a loyal and older wolf named Gregor, whose weathered face was a map of countless campaigns, was the only one who dared to approach him in these moods. One evening, finding the king staring eastward with a haunted look, Gregor spoke, his voice a low rumble of concern. "Your Majesty, the pack feels your distress. It makes them uneasy. The kingdom needs a steady hand, not a clenched fist." Alaric didn't turn. His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the cold stone parapet. For a long moment he said nothing, the wind whipping his dark cloak around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, scraped thin by his inner battle. "The moon is a curse this cycle, old friend," he rasped, the words torn from him. "It sings a song I cannot ignore, and it calls for a woman I have already cast aside." He finally turned to face his beta, his silver eyes burning with a feverish light. "Prepare the castle, bar the gates. No one gets in or out on the night of the blood moon." Gregor's own eyes widened slightly at the mention of the blood moon, a name spoken only in whispers, but he simply nodded, his loyalty absolute even in the face of his king's apparent madness. He knew better than to ask who the woman was. He had been there at the wedding. He had seen the look on the king's face, and he had seen the girl flee. Her punishment for being found in the royal gardens, the place of her breakdown, was a task meant to be both tedious and isolating. She was sent to the lower library, a place forgotten by time, to sort and catalog a chaotic jumble of old scrolls and crumbling tomes that had not been touched in centuries. The air was thick with the dry, sweet scent of decaying paper, and dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom from high, grimy windows. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten knowledge, that Evelyn's new life took another turn. Days were spent with her fingers stained by ink and her tunic covered in dust. But her mind, starved for stimulation, came alive. She was no longer just a disgraced bride. She was a scholar by necessity, her intellect becoming her primary tool for survival. One afternoon, while struggling with a heavy, leather-bound tome whose cover had long since rotted away, it fell open on a dusty table. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown, but the script was elegant and clear. Her eyes caught a phrase, Luna sanguis, the blood moon. Her breath caught in her throat. With painstaking care, she read the cryptic passage. It spoke of the celestial event that occurred only once in a generation, a time when the veil between the physical and magical worlds was at its thinnest. It spoke of a prophecy tied directly to the Alpha King's bloodline, a prophecy of immense power and terrible risk. The text was maddeningly obscure, full of metaphors and riddles. It mentioned a fated mate, whose arrival would coincide with the blood moon's cycle, and a union of fire and ice. This union, the ancient scribe had written, was not a gentle merging, but a cataclysmic event that would either forge a new, unbreakable destiny for all the werewolf packs or shatter them into oblivion, plunging their world into a new dark age. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Fire and ice. She thought of Alaric's cold fury and the strange, inexplicable warmth she had felt in his presence. She traced the words with a trembling finger, a sense of dread and electrifying purpose warring within her. This was not just history. It felt like a warning, a map to the madness that was currently gripping the king and the entire castle. As the day shortened and the moon swelled toward its full blood-red glory, a strange and palpable energy began to thrum in the very stones of the castle. It was a fever in the air, a mounting tension that set everyone on edge. The tides in the nearby sea ran unusually high, crashing against the cliffs below the keep with a frantic, violent energy. In the castle kennels, the wolves were restless and agitated, their howls carrying a new, mournful note that chilled the blood of those who heard it. The world itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a storm to break. Evelyn felt it more keenly than anyone, the subtle pull she had occasionally felt in her chest, the hum in her blood that had once been a mystery, now intensified into a constant, undeniable thrum. It was a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to echo the king's own agitation, a psychic string connecting her to the tormented man on the battlements. She would be kneading dough in the kitchens and would suddenly be hit by a wave of cold, furious frustration that was not her own, forcing her to grip the edge of the table until it passed. The connection invaded her sleep. She began to have vivid, recurring dreams. In them, she was running barefoot through a dense, moon-drenched forest. The trees were black silhouettes against a sky that bled crimson, dominated by a moon so large and red it felt like a wound in the heavens. A sense of primal fear and desperate urgency propelled her forward. But she was not running from something. She was running to it. And behind her, she could always hear the heavy, rhythmic panting of a great wolf. She never saw it clearly, but she knew it was there, a massive silver beast whose paws barely made a sound on the forest floor. It was pursuing her not with aggression, but with a desperate, soul-deep longing that resonated through the dreamscape. And in the fleeting moments before she would wake up, her heart pounding and her skin slick with sweat, the wolf would draw close enough that she could see its eyes, glowing with an inner fire, and she knew them instantly. They were the tormented silver eyes of the king. The night arrived not with the gentle fall of darkness, but as if a celestial wound had opened in the sky, bleeding crimson across the heavens. The moon rose, huge and engorged, a blood-red eye staring down at the world. It was not the soft, silvery light of a normal lunar cycle. This was a hostile, predatory glow that bathed the entire kingdom in an eerie, unsettling luminescence. The gray stone walls of Silverwood Keep were stained a deep arterial red. The forest beyond looked as if they were on fire, and the sea crashed against the cliffs in carmine-tipped waves. Within the castle, the air grew thick, heavy with a primal energy that vibrated in the bones and set teeth on edge. It was a tangible force, a wild magic that stripped away the thin veneer of civility and whispered to the ancient, beastly instincts that lay dormant in every werewolf's soul. Guards on the battlements gripped their spears with white-knuckled tension, their eyes wide and feral. Servants huddled in the kitchens, their conversations reduced to fearful whispers as the unsettling energy coiled in their stomachs. The very air tasted of blood and ozone, a promise of violence and raw, untamed emotion. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to writhe with a life of its own, and the silence between the gusts of wind was profound and menacing, filled with the unspoken dread of a world turned upside down, a kingdom held hostage by the bloody gaze of the moon. In his heavily fortified royal chambers, Alaric lost his battle. For weeks he had fought it, a war waged within his own mind and body, using iron-willed discipline and brutal self-denial as his only weapons. But against the overwhelming power of the blood moon, his defenses were nothing more than sandcastles against a tidal wave. The prophecy, the bond, the moon, it was a trinity of forces too ancient and powerful for any one man, even a king, to defy. A guttural roar of agony was torn from his throat as the transformation began, but it was not the clean, swift change of a controlled shift. This was a violent, chaotic tearing apart. His bones cracked and reset with sickeningly loud pops, his body contorting on the floor as muscle and sinew were brutally reshaped by a power he could no longer command. His royal clothes, the fine silks and leathers of a king, were ripped to shreds as his form swelled and twisted. The change was incomplete, a horrifying halfway point between man and beast. His features elongated into a lupine snarl. But his eyes, those tormented silver eyes, remained now glowing with a feral crimson light that mirrored the moon outside. He was a terrifying, semi-lupine creature, a monster born of a king's denial and a wolf's desperate need. He staggered to his feet, his new form unsteady, and let out a soul-shattering howl. It was not a sound of aggression or a challenge to a rival. It was a howl of pure, desperate, heart-wrenching longing, a sound of such profound agony and need that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. And as the sound ripped through the night, it carried with it on a psychic current that transcended mere sound, a single, undeniable name: Evelyn. In her small, cold room in the servants' quarters, Evelyn heard the howl not just with her ears, but with her entire being. It was not a sound that traveled through the air to be processed by her senses. It was a command that detonated directly in her soul. The constant, thrumming pull she had been feeling for weeks, the psychic string that tied her to the king, was yanked with brutal, irresistible force. Her breath hitched, her heart slammed against her ribs, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to hide, to bar the door, to cower under her thin blanket. But the call was absolute. It was a command she could not disobey, as fundamental and undeniable as breathing. Her body moved before her mind could protest, her feet finding the cold stone floor of their own accord. The fear was immense, a cold, coiling serpent in her gut. But underneath it, buried deep, was a strange and powerful sense of inevitability, a feeling of being pulled toward a destiny she had been running from since the day of her public humiliation. It felt, in a terrifying and inexplicable way, like going home. She slipped out of her room, a ghost in a simple gray tunic, and moved through the deserted corridors of the castle. The world was painted in the surreal, bloody light of the moon. Every familiar hallway and staircase rendered alien and menacing. The castle was silent, the other inhabitants either locked away in fear or lost to the moon's primal call. Her path was not chosen, it was dictated by the pull in her chest, a living compass needle pointing her toward the source of that agonizing howl, toward the epicenter of her fear and her fate. She found him in the central courtyard, the very place where nobles once strolled and ladies gossiped. Now, it was an arena for a primal drama. He was there, a monstrous figure silhouetted against the bloody moon, a nightmare given form. He was on all fours, his powerful frame hunched over, his royal clothes hanging in tatters from his twisted body. His head was low, and a deep guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the flagstones and up into the soles of Evelyn's bare feet. He smelled of rain, of wild musk, and of a deep burning rage that was directed not at her, but at himself. Then he lifted his head, and his eyes, glowing with that feral red light, locked onto hers. The growl intensified, and he began to move. He stalked toward her, not with a direct charge, but with a slow, deliberate circling, the movements of a predator assessing its prey. He was a creature of pure instinct, the king buried deep beneath layers of primal fury and lunar madness. Evelyn was frozen, not by indecision, but by a terror so profound it was paralyzing. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn and flee, to run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. Yet she stood her ground, her back pressed against the cold, unyielding stone of a courtyard pillar, her gaze locked with his. She could see the battle raging within him, the conflict in those glowing red eyes. The beast saw a mate, the man saw the woman he had wronged, and the moon demanded a resolution. The air crackled with the tension, a silent, violent standoff between the girl who had been rejected and the king who had been consumed. He closed the distance in a final fluid motion, the predator trapping its quarry. Evelyn flinched, her eyes squeezing shut as he loomed over her, his massive form blocking out the red moonlight, plunging her into shadow. She braced for the tearing of claws, the crushing of jaws, the violent end she had been running from all along. But it did not come. Instead of an attack, she felt his hot, ragged breath on her skin as he pressed his face into the delicate curve of her neck. A shuddering, desperate breath racked his entire body as he inhaled her scent. A long, deep draft, as if he were a man dying of thirst, and she was the only water in the world. The touch, when it came, was not violent. It was possessive, desperate, the touch of a being claiming what was irrevocably his. One of his hands, now a terrifying hybrid of human fingers and lupine claws, came up to her shoulder. Evelyn's breath hitched, a sob of pure terror catching in her throat, but he was surprisingly gentle. A faint silvery light, a stark contrast to the bloody glow of the moon, began to emanate from the tip of one long, dark claw. With a surgeon's precision, he gently grazed the skin of her shoulder, just above her collarbone. It didn't break the skin, there was no blood, but a searing, cold fire shot through her veins, a sensation both painful and ecstatic. Where his claw had touched, a mark began to glow, a swirling, intricate pattern that looked like a miniature constellation, a spiral of silver light that pulsed with a life of its own. It was a supernatural mark of claiming, a brand of fate that burned not her flesh, but her very soul, sealing their bond in a way that no vow or law ever could. The raw, terrifying power of the moment washed over her. The heat of his breath, the wild musk of his scent, the cold fire of the mark, and the overwhelming, undeniable sense of destiny. A great and terrible cosmic gear, finally clicking into place. The king's wolf had chosen its mate. and the prophecy was now irrevocably set in motion. The first rays of dawn pierced the crimson haze, washing the world in pale, watery gold. The oppressive magic of the blood moon receded like a fever breaking, leaving behind a chilling, sober clarity. In the center of the courtyard, Alaric awoke with a gasp. His human form returned, sprawled on the cold flagstones amidst the tatters of his royal attire. Memory crashed down on him, not as a dream, but as a series of horrifyingly vivid images. The monstrous form, the feral rage, the desperate, soul-deep howl. He scrambled into a sitting position, his body aching, his mind reeling with a self-loathing so profound it was nauseating. And then he saw her. Evelyn was slumped at the base of a stone pillar, her simple tunic smudged with dirt, her face pale and exhausted. She was watching him, her expression not of terror, but of a deep, weary stillness. His gaze fell to her shoulder, and his breath caught in his throat. There, against her skin, the mark glowed with a soft, silvery light, a beautiful, damning constellation that pulsed in time with his own frantic heartbeat. It was real. He had done it. He had branded her, chained her to the very fate he had sought to protect her from. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over him. He had to reinstate the distance, rebuild the wall between them, for her sake. He staggered to his feet, pulling the shredded remains of his cloak around himself, a pathetic attempt at dignity. "Get back to your quarters," he commanded, his voice a harsh, grating sound. He could not look at her, could not bear to see the consequence of his weakness in her eyes. He turned his back on her and strode toward the keep, each step an act of will, but the bond, the cursed, beautiful bond, was now a tangible thing, a living cord of energy stretching between them, and with every foot of distance he put between them, it pulled tighter, a painful psychic friction that promised this new reality would not be so easily denied. The days that followed were a silent, agonizing war. They discovered the true invasive nature of the bond, an unspoken connection that respected no walls and no privacy. It was a terrifying and disorienting intimacy. One afternoon, as Evelyn tended the resilient roses in her small garden, her hands deep in the cool earth, she was suddenly slammed by a wave of searing, frustrated anger. It was so powerful it made her gasp and stumble back, her heart hammering. It was not her emotion. It was his. Through the bond, she could feel him in a tense council meeting, his authority being questioned, his patience fraying. The feeling was a violation, a raw, unfiltered glimpse into his soul. Later that week, Alaric was in his study, poring over maps of the Northern Territories, when a profound wave of sadness washed over him. A quiet, aching sorrow that felt like the gray light of a winter afternoon. It was so potent it blurred the ink on the parchment before him. He knew with absolute certainty that it was Evelyn's. He could feel her loneliness, her isolation, a quiet grief for a life that was gone forever. It was an invasion, and he hated it, hated the way her feelings bled into him, a constant reminder of his failure. He tried to manage it by avoiding her, by ensuring their paths never crossed. But this only made the psychic friction worse, a constant low-grade hum of shared misery. Evelyn, however, refused to remain a passive victim in this strange, shared existence. She began to experiment. In the quiet of her small room, she would focus on the thrumming connection, not fighting it, but exploring its edges. One evening, feeling a spike of his familiar, restless agitation, she closed her eyes and focused not on a thought, but on a feeling. She pictured the quiet, resilient roses in her garden, the way they thrived despite the thorns and the poor soil. She poured the feeling of that quiet strength, that stubborn endurance, into the bond. In his chambers, pacing like a caged wolf, Alaric stopped dead. A sudden, inexplicable sense of calm washed over him, an image flashing in his mind, not a clear picture, but the distinct impression of green leaves and defiant pink blooms, It was a message of strength, of resilience, and it startled him to his core. It was her. She was not just receiving, she was sending. She was not just a victim of the bond, she was learning to wield it. The summons came via a royal page, a formal, crisp command that sent a fresh spike of anxiety through Alaric. He was to present himself in the chambers of Alara, the Dowager Elder. Alara had been his father's most trusted advisor, a she-wolf of immense age and wisdom whose eyes had seen the turning of 100 seasons. Her chambers were in the oldest part of the keep, a circular room at the top of a winding spire, its walls lined not with tapestries, but with ancient celestial charts and maps of forgotten lands. The air smelled of dried herbs, old parchment, and something else, something faintly magical, like ozone after a lightning strike. Alara was seated by a large arched window, her face a web of fine lines, her long silver hair braided with charms of bone and wood. She did not rise when he entered. "You have been busy, young king," she said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. She gestured to a chair opposite her. "Sit." Alaric obeyed, feeling like a chastised boy rather than a king. "I know about the claiming," she stated, cutting straight through any pretense. "I felt it, as did every wolf with a drop of the old blood. You have set in motion the one thing you swore to prevent." Alaric's jaw tightened. "I rejected her, to save us all from this," he bit out, the words raw with his long-held torment. "The prophecy speaks of ruin. I saw it as my duty to prevent it. Now the moon has forced my hand, and I have chained her to a cursed fate." Alara watched him, her dark eyes missing nothing. "You have only ever understood half of it, Alaric. You read the warnings, but not the words between them." She rose slowly and walked to a large, leather-bound tome on a lectern. "The union under the blood moon does not sentence us to chaos. It forces a choice. The fated pair, you and the girl, become a conduit, a vessel for a power so immense it can reshape the world. If your bond is allowed to fester, to be corrupted by fear and doubt, that power will turn inward and become a weapon. It will shatter the pacts and bring about the dark age you so fear. But," she said, her voice dropping, "if the bond is accepted, if it is forged in trust and sacrifice, that same power can be used to heal the fractured werewolf kingdoms, to unite the packs as they have not been for 1,000 years." She turned to face him, her gaze pinning him in place. "Your rejection was an act of fear, not wisdom. You cannot fight fate, young king. You can only choose how you face it. The prophecy is not a sentence, it is a question, and the two of you must answer it together." The fragile secret world Alaric and Evelyn now inhabited was shattered by the arrival of a delegation from the north. News of the king's increasingly erratic behavior, the locked gates on the night of the blood moon, and the strange electric tension that still clung to Silverwood Keep had spread like wildfire through the other packs. And where there is instability, there are always vultures waiting to circle. Lord Malachi, the ruthless alpha of the Northern Frostfang pack, a longtime rival of Alaric's house, saw his opportunity. He was a wolf of brutal ambition, who ruled his own frozen lands with an iron fist, and he had always coveted the fertile territories and ancient power of the Silverwood pack. He began to sow dissent among the other alphas, his whispers carrying on the wind like poison, suggesting that Alaric was unstable, that his bloodline was tainted, that he was a cursed leader unfit to rule. The envoy from Malachi arrived with a great deal of pomp and ceremony, a tall, sneering wolf named Lord Kell, whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He requested an audience with the king and his council, and his message, delivered in a voice as smooth and slick as oil, was a masterpiece of thinly veiled threat. "Lord Malachi sends his deepest concerns," Cale announced to the assembled court, his gaze sweeping over them with condescending pity. "He has heard troubling rumors of instability in these lands, of a king plagued by afflictions. He wishes only to offer his support, his strength, in these trying times. The implication was clear. Malachi was positioning himself as a savior, a steady hand to take the reins from a failing king. The words were a declaration of intent, a political maneuver designed to test Alaric's strength and isolate him from his allies. Alaric sat on his throne, his face a mask of cold fury, the unsolicited emotions of his council, a mixture of fear, anger, and doubt, crashing against him through the bond. He could feel the siege beginning, not with swords and arrows, but with whispers and lies. The vultures were circling, drawn by the scent of blood in the water, and he knew with a chilling certainty that the greatest threat to his kingdom was no longer a prophecy, but the very real ambition of the wolf in the north. The scent of crushed mint and damp earth was a small comfort, a grounding reality in a life that had become surreal. Evelyn worked in the herb garden, her hands moving with a familiar rhythm, weeding around the sturdy stems of lavender. The sun was warm on her back, and for a moment a fragile peace settled over her. The bond was a quiet hum in the back of her mind, Alaric's presence a steady, distant warmth. He was in the armory. She could feel his focused calm as he inspected the kingdom's defenses. A guard she vaguely recognized passed the gate to the garden, his head nodding in a brief, dismissive acknowledgement. She paid him no mind, turning back to her work. The hum of the bond was the first warning, a sudden, discordant screech of alarm that was not her own. It was Alaric's protective instinct flaring before he even knew why. In the next instant, a shadow fell over her. She looked up from her crouched position, and the guard was there. His face no longer dismissive, but twisted into a mask of grim purpose. In his hand was not a spear, but a short, wicked-looking dagger, its blade coated in a dark, viscous substance. Time seemed to slow. She saw the muscles in his arm tense, the dagger beginning its arc toward her throat. A blinding flash of pure, undiluted terror. Her terror erupted through the bond. A psychic scream that crossed the castle in less than a heartbeat. In the armory, Alaric dropped the sword he was inspecting with a deafening clang. The flash of Evelyn's fear hit him not as an emotion, but as a physical blow, a white, hot agony that stole the air from his lungs. There was no thought, no plan, only a singular, overriding imperative. Get to her. He moved. He did not run. He exploded, a blur of motion that sent guards and courtiers scattering in his wake. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of alpha power unleashed, crossing courtyards and corridors with a speed that was not human. He burst into the herb garden just as the assassin's blade began its descent. The world saw a flicker, a shadow detaching from the keep and crossing the garden in a blink. The assassin's eyes widened in shock as a hand like an iron vice clamped around his wrist, stopping the dagger an inch from Evelyn's skin. The sound of bone snapping was sickeningly loud in the quiet garden. The assassin screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short as Alaric's other hand slammed into his chest, sending him flying backward to crash into the stone wall with the force of a catapult launch. Alaric didn't spare the crumpled form a glance. He was on his knees before Evelyn, his hands hovering over her, his silver eyes blazing with a protective fury that was terrifying and beautiful. He scanned her for injury, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. He felt the echo of her terror, the cold dread still clinging to her, and a rage so profound, so absolute, filled him that the very air around them seemed to tremble. Hiding her, he realized with sickening clarity, had not protected her. It had only made her a target. That evening, the great hall was filled again, not with the finery of a wedding, but with the grim faces of a court summoned by emergency decree. A nervous, confused murmur filled the vast space. Alaric stood before the throne, his face carved from stone, waiting. Then the great doors opened, and a hush fell. He walked in, but he was not alone. Evelyn was at his side, her hand held firmly in his. She wore a simple blue dress, no jewels, no finery, but she walked with a newfound straightness to her spine, her head held high. They walked the length of the hall together, a silent, united front, stopping before the dais where she had been so brutally cast aside. Alaric pulled her gently forward, his grip on her hand unwavering. With his other hand, he pushed aside the collar of her dress, exposing her shoulder to the hundreds of watching eyes. The mark, which had faded to a faint shimmer, flared to life under his touch, glowing with a soft, undeniable silver light, a constellation burning on her skin. The court erupted in a collective gasp, a wave of shock and disbelief. "You see this mark," Alaric's voice boomed, silencing the chaos. It was not the cold, cutting voice of the rejection. It was the voice of a king claiming his destiny, a sound of thunder and iron. It was bestowed by the moon itself, a power older than any of our laws. I rejected her out of fear for this kingdom. His gaze swept over the stunned faces, challenging any of them to speak. I claim her now out of love for it. She is your queen. An attack on her is treason, and it will be met with death. He pulled Evelyn to his side, his arm wrapping around her waist in a gesture of absolute possession and protection. The court devolved into chaos, nobles shouting, some pointing, others looking to their rivals, sensing a shift in the currents of power. But above the din, one thing was clear: the disgraced girl was gone, and in her place stood the Luna Queen of the Silverwood Pack. In the quiet, star-dusted sanctuary of Ilara's spire, the true work began. The public declaration had been a necessary gambit, but it had also started a clock ticking toward open war. Now, united as a team, Alaric and Evelyn sat with the ancient elder, the prophetic tome open on the table between them. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and the weight of their task. "The prophecy is a question," Ilara reiterated, her long bony finger tracing the faded script. "It offers a choice between ruin and renewal, but the path is a riddle." Alaric, his brow furrowed in concentration, read the lines aloud, his voice a low rumble. "The wolf must shed its skin, the flower give up its bloom. Only through loss is the great power won, to seal the darkness in its tomb." He shook his head in frustration. "It's meaningless, metaphor and nonsense." But Evelyn was still, her gaze distant. The flower giving up its bloom. She thought of her garden, of the roses that bloomed and died, their petals falling to enrich the soil for the next season. She remembered the feeling of the bond, the magic of the pack that now hummed in her veins, a power she was only just beginning to understand, a power that made her a Luna. Her breath caught. "The flower," she whispered, her eyes meeting Ilara's. "The flower is the mate. The bloom is the magic." Alaric looked at her, his expression shifting from frustration to dawning comprehension. Evelyn's gaze moved to the first line. "The wolf shedding its skin," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The skin of a wolf is its strength, its dominance. For an alpha, it's his power, his very status as alpha." A heavy silence fell over the room as the terrible weight of her words settled. The riddle was not a metaphor. It was a literal, heart-wrenching choice. To unlock the prophecy's positive outcome, to gain the power needed to unite the packs and defeat their enemies, one of them had to make an ultimate sacrifice. One of them had to willingly give up the very core of their being. Either Alaric must relinquish his alpha power, becoming a common wolf and leaving his kingdom defenseless, or Evelyn must sever her newfound connection to the pack's magic, giving up the bond, her status as Luna, and the very essence of what made her his fated mate. The formal challenge arrived the next day, delivered by a grim-faced herald from the Frostfang pack. Lord Malachi, citing the king's madness and his blasphemous union with a cursed woman, formally challenged Alaric's right to rule. He called for a trial by combat, a fight to the death, to be held at the next full moon in the ancient arena of fates. It was the move Alaric had been expecting. He accepted without hesitation, his voice ringing with a newfound resolute calm that surprised his council. The fear that had plagued him for months was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. He would not lose his kingdom, and he would not lose his queen. He convened a war council immediately, his most loyal alphas gathering in the strategy room, a stark chamber dominated by a massive stone table carved with a map of the territories. But this time, there was a new presence. Evelyn entered at his side, and a wave of skeptical, resentful silence fell over the battle-hardened wolves. They saw a slip of a girl, a former servant, standing in a room meant for warriors. Alaric ignored their grumbling and gestured for her to take a seat beside him. "Lord Malachi thinks with brute force," Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the gruff, tense atmosphere. The alphas looked at her, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright scorn. "He expects a direct confrontation at the arena. He will march his army to our borders to display his strength and intimidate our allies." Gregor, Alaric's beta, nodded grimly. "His army is larger. A straight battle would be costly." "Exactly," Evelyn agreed. She leaned forward, her finger tracing a path on the stone map, a path the warriors had overlooked. "But his supply lines are long. They stretch for miles through the Blackwood Pass. Here." The alphas leaned in, their eyes following her finger. "It is narrow, treacherous terrain. He will assume we are focused on fortifying our walls for a siege. He will not expect an attack on his tail. A small, fast-moving party, traveling light, could move through the mountains, collapse the pass, and cut him off. His army will be left starving in the foothills before they even reach our walls. We fight not just with claws," she concluded, her gaze meeting the eyes of each alpha in turn, but with minds. A slow, grudging respect began to dawn on the faces of the hardened warriors. They had seen only a battlefield. She had seen the entire board. The disgraced bride was gone, and in her place was a strategist, a leader, a queen. The full moon, cold and indifferent, hung like a polished silver shield in the black velvet sky, its light pouring down into the arena of fates. This was a place of brutal endings and bloody beginnings, a massive ancient coliseum carved from the mountain itself by the first alphas, its stone tiers filled with the silent, watchful forms of their descendants. They were a jury of predators, the alphas from every major pack, their eyes gleaming with cold assessment in the moonlight, their presence a heavy, oppressive weight. Tonight, they were here to witness a king's potential death and the birth of a new order. In the center of the sand-swept floor, two massive wolves circled each other. Lord Malachi was a nightmare of muscle and malice, a great beast of pure black fur, his body a roadmap of old scars, his yellow eyes burning with a savage, greedy light. He was bigger, heavier, a creature born of the frozen north's unforgiving cruelty. Facing him, Alaric was a flash of silver, leaner but coiled with a desperate energy. The fight began not with a roar, but with a sudden explosive charge. They met in the center of the arena with a sound like a thunderclap, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. The sand flew, stained dark with blood almost immediately. Malachi fought with brute, overwhelming force, his powerful jaws snapping, his heavy paws striking like hammers. He was a berserker, driven by pure, savage ambition. Alaric was faster, more agile, his movements a dance of evasion and sharp, calculated strikes. He dodged a clumsy, powerful lunge from Malachi, his own claws tearing a long gash along the black wolf's flank. Malachi roared in fury and pain, shaking his massive head and charging again, this time ignoring any pretense of strategy. He crashed into Alaric, his sheer weight sending the silver wolf tumbling across the sand. Before Alaric could recover, Malachi was on him, his jaws closing on Alaric's shoulder. Alaric howled, a sharp cry of agony that echoed off the stone walls, and he could feel the bone grind under the immense pressure. He twisted violently, kicking out with his hind legs, his claws finding purchase in Malachi's soft underbelly. The black wolf grunted and released his grip, but the damage was done. Alaric's left shoulder was a mess of torn muscle and blood, his movements now slower, his left leg dragging slightly. The tide of the battle began to turn. Malachi, sensing his advantage, pressed his attack relentlessly. He was a storm of black fur and snapping teeth, giving Alaric no room to breathe, no moment to recover. Each blow from Malachi's heavy paws felt like a physical manifestation of his own past failures. Each gasp for air, a reminder of the prophecy he had tried to run from. He was weakening, his strength draining away with every drop of blood that stained the sand beneath him. High above, on a stone balcony reserved for the royal line, Evelyn watched, her hands gripping the cold stone railing so tightly her knuckles were white. She did not need to see the blood to know he was failing. She could feel it. The bond, that invisible, unbreakable cord that tied her soul to his, was now a conduit for his agony. She felt the searing pain in his shoulder, the burning exhaustion in his muscles, the cold tendrils of desperation beginning to coil around his heart. His hope was a flickering candle flame in a rising gale, and she felt every terrifying flicker as if it were her own. He was going to die. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. Malachi would kill him, and the kingdom would fall into darkness. The prophecy's worst outcome realized. Alara stood beside her, a silent, steady presence in the swirling vortex of Evelyn's fear. "The choice is now, my queen," the old wolf whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. Evelyn closed her eyes, shutting out the brutal spectacle below. She saw Alaric's face in her mind, the flash of agonizing regret in his eyes at the altar, the protective fury when he saved her from the assassin, the quiet vulnerability when they worked together to decipher the prophecy. She loved him. It was a truth that had grown in the ruins of her old life, a resilient flower pushing its way through cracked stone. And love, she now understood, was not about receiving. It was about giving. She made her choice. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a profound quiet certainty. She turned to Alara, her eyes clear and resolute. "Tell me what to do." Following the elder's soft instructions, Evelyn began the ritual. She placed her hands over her heart, her palms flat against her simple dress. She began to chant the words from the tome, her voice a low, steady murmur against the distant sounds of the fight. The words were ancient, a language of pure magic that vibrated not in the air but in her very soul. As she spoke, she focused inward, gathering the power that had been gifted to her by the moon. She felt it as a warm, silver light coalescing in her chest, the very essence of her connection to the pack, the magic that made her a Luna, the energy that formed the bond with Alaric. It was her life force as a werewolf mate, a vibrant, living power. The prophecy demanded a sacrifice, the flower giving up its bloom. With a final whispered word, she pushed. She willingly, consciously severed the connection. The pain was unimaginable, a spiritual tearing, as if a vital part of her soul was being ripped away. A silent scream echoed in her mind, and her knees buckled. But she did not stop. She took that blindingly bright ball of silver energy, her very essence, and poured it outward, a final desperate act of love. Down in the arena, Alaric was on his knees. His vision was blurring, his lungs burned, and the metallic taste of his own blood filled his mouth. Malachi stood over him, a triumphant, guttural growl rumbling in his chest, his black fur matted with blood, both his and Alaric's. The black wolf raised a heavy paw, claws extended, for the final, killing blow. It was over, and then it happened. A wave of power, so immense and pure it defied description, slammed into him. It was not the savage, chaotic energy of a wolf's rage. It was a wave of pure, unconditional love made manifest. A torrent of silver light and impossibly potent warmth that flooded every cell of his being. The searing pain in his shoulder vanished, his wounds knitting closed with impossible speed. The crushing exhaustion was washed away, replaced by a strength he had never known, a power that hummed in his bones and sang in his blood. With the power came a sudden, profound silence in his mind. The bond, the constant, thrumming connection to Evelyn, was gone. In its place was only the echo of her presence, the memory of her love. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with his soul. A crystal-clear vision of her on the balcony, her face pale, her body slumping, a stream of silver light flowing from her heart to his. She had done it. The flower had given up its bloom. She had sacrificed everything, her magic, her status, their bond for him. A roar of incandescent fury and heart-shattering love erupted from him. It was not the howl of a beast, but the cry of a king who had just been given everything and had everything taken from him. Malachi stumbled back, momentarily stunned by the sheer force of the sound and the blinding surge of power radiating from the silver wolf. Alaric rose to his feet, no longer a wounded animal, but an avenging angel. His silver furs seemed to glow, his eyes burning with a righteous, white-hot fire. He moved with a grace and speed that was terrifying, a blur of silver light and righteous fury. The fight was no longer a contest, it was an execution. He met Malachi's panicked charge, not with brute force, but with fluid precision, sidestepping the clumsy attack and sinking his teeth into the black wolf's neck. There was a sharp crack of bone, and it was over. Malachi fell to the sand, his savage ambition extinguished in an instant. A profound silence fell over the arena. The jury of Alphas stared, stunned, at the impossible reversal. Alaric stood over his vanquished foe, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from the overwhelming force of his emotions. He ignored the silent stares of the other Alphas. He ignored the dead wolf at his feet. He lifted his head and his gaze shot upward, across the vast expanse of the arena, to the balcony. He found her. She was pale, leaning heavily on Alara, but she was standing. Their eyes met. The psychic bond was gone. He could no longer feel her emotions or hear her thoughts, but in that single shared glance, a new connection was forged, stronger than any magic, a bond of sacrifice, of choice, of a love that had stared into the abyss and refused to break. He was her king, and she was his queen, not by the decree of the moon or the laws of prophecy, but by the undeniable power of their shared hearts. A new era for the Silverwood Pack, and for all the kingdoms, had begun, not with a crown or a conquest, but with a sacrifice, and the quiet, unbreakable promise in a king's gaze. Their reign would not be about power, but about partnership, a kingdom fortified not by fear, but by a love that had proven it was strong enough to rewrite destiny itself. Together, they would build a new world from the ashes of the old.